Every neighborhood has its rhythms. The sound of sprinklers before sunrise, mailboxes closing at noon, children's voices carrying into the evening. You grow to recognize these sounds. You trust them. You believe you know what they mean. But what if behind that routine something else was unfolding? What if the person who waved to you every morning wasn't who they claimed to be? This is the story of a place where nothing ever seemed out of place until everything was. Hollow Creek wasn't famous. It wasn't notorious. Just another quiet American town with a single grocery store, a single high school, and a police force that mostly handled noise complaints and parking tickets. People left their doors unlocked. Everyone knew who drove what truck. And for a long time, that was enough. Until October 17th. That morning, the Carter family didn't show up where they were expected. No calls, no texts, no signs of trouble, just silence. It started with a missed school pickup, then a no-show at work. By evening, the questions were multiplying. Quiet ones at first, then urgent, then frantic. Within 24 hours, a missing persons report was filed. Within 72, the town would never feel the same. This wasn't just a family that vanished. This was a family known, seen, loved. People had eaten at their table, watched their kids grow, shared summers and birthdays, and now they were gone. Police assumed they'd find something, a note, a sign of struggle, a trail to follow. But there was nothing. No broken locks, no forced entry, no blood. And that's what made it worse. In the absence of chaos, in the neatness of the scene, something felt deeply wrong, like something had been removed. What happened next would unravel the town's sense of safety thread by thread. As detectives pushed deeper, they uncovered a chain of decisions, secrets, and silences that had gone undetected for years. And at the center of it all, someone who had been standing in plain sight. This is the story of how one family's disappearance exposed everything that was hidden beneath Hollow Creek's calm surface. The lies, the trust, the danger no one saw coming. Over the next 2 hours, we will retrace every step, from the morning the Carters vanished to the moment a locked basement door was finally opened. And what was waiting on the other side? Hollow Creek sits tucked between 2 state highways, too small to earn its own dot on most maps. Surrounded by dense pine woods and slow, winding roads, it was the kind of place people passed through, not the kind they stopped in. And for the people who lived there, that's exactly how they liked it. Main Street stretched just 5 blocks. There was one diner, one barber shop, and a church with a tilted steeple that hadn't rung its bell in over 20 years. Kids rode their bikes without helmets. Retirees waved from porch swings, and everyone knew which cars didn't belong. It was this tight-knit familiarity that made the Carter family so visible and so missed when they were gone. The Carters had moved to Hollow Creek from Columbus in 2016. The father, Marcus, had been a youth pastor before taking a job at a local hardware supplier. People described him as soft-spoken, polite, the kind of man who remembered birthdays and showed up early to help neighbors move. His wife, Denise, worked part-time at the elementary school. She supervised recess, ran PTA meetings, and organized the annual spring bake sale. Friendly, kind, a presence everyone recognized, even if they didn't know her well. Their 2 children, Liam, age 10, and Ava, age 7, were inseparable. They rode the bus together, played in the schoolyard together, and were often seen chasing each other through the church parking lot after Sunday service. To anyone looking in from the outside, the Carters were stable, grounded, ordinary in the best way. But the story of what happened to them is anything but. The perpetrator, unknown at this stage. At first, there was no clear suspect, no signs of foul play, just a family that seemed to have vanished. But as investigators began to comb through their lives, a pattern began to emerge. A subtle, almost invisible thread that wound through their friendships, their routines, and their quiet, trusted lives. And that thread led to someone few had ever questioned. Someone who had stood beside them, smiled in family photos, attended barbecues, shook hands with the very people who would later search for their remains. But that part of the story comes later. The first sign that something might not be right came months before the disappearance, but at the time no one saw it for what it was. It began with small things. Liam mentioned to a teacher that he didn't like staying late at home anymore. Denise started declining invitations she used to accept without hesitation. And Marcus, according to his co-workers, had started locking his office door, something he'd never done before. Individually, none of it raised alarms. Together, in hindsight, it reads like a slow unwinding, a quiet build towards something no one had the language to describe. There were no open threats, no public confrontations, just a family drawing inward, shutting doors, pulling curtains closed a little earlier each night. By the time the Carter house went silent on October 17th, whatever had begun months earlier had already reached its end. The last week of the Carters' life looked almost exactly like the one before it. On Monday, October 10th, Marcus Carter arrived to work at 7:45 a.m., 15 minutes early as usual. He wore the same navy windbreaker he always did in the fall, parked in the same spot, drank the same coffee from the corner station. Security footage confirms all of this. But something was different. He didn't speak much. His usual morning banter was absent. When asked how he was doing, he simply said, "Tired, long week. It was only Monday." Denise Carter was seen at the grocery store that same afternoon. Surveillance footage captured her moving through the aisles quickly, almost distracted. She bought 2 gallons of milk, canned soup, batteries, and a set of large trash bags. The cashier, an 18-year-old high school student, remembered her distinctly because Denise dropped a $5 bill and took several seconds to notice. When the young man handed it back, she looked startled, almost as if she'd forgotten where she was. On Tuesday, Liam didn't go to school. The school received a call from Denise claiming he had a fever. By Thursday, Ava was also absent. Neither child had a record of illness before that week. This caught the attention of their teacher, Mrs. Holloway, not because of the absences, but because Ava had left her backpack behind on Monday and no one came to collect it. By Friday, October 14th, the family had gone quiet. There were no updates, no errands run. Denise didn't show up to her lunch shift at the elementary school. Marcus didn't clock in to work. Both of their cell phones were no longer active. The only thing that seemed unusual to neighbors was the garage light. It was on continuously for 3 nights straight. The Carters' next-door neighbor, Tom Riley, later told investigators he noticed the light, but assumed the family had gone out of town and left it on by mistake. He never saw the family leave. No one did. What happened inside the Carter home between the night of October 14th and the early hours of October 15th remains to this day partially unknown. But what investigators were able to piece together from the evidence tells a story far darker than anyone expected. The front door showed no signs of forced entry. All windows were locked from the inside. There were no broken items, no scattered belongings. In fact, the house was disturbingly clean. Too clean. The beds were made. Dishes were washed. The kitchen trash had been emptied. But the refrigerator was full, untouched. The children's backpacks were sitting by the door, zipped, ready for school. Denise's car keys were on the counter. Marcus's wallet was still in the drawer by the TV. But there were things missing: shoes, a photo album, 1 suitcase, and Denise's journal. In the master bedroom closet, police found a series of deep scratches along the inside paneling, vertical grooves low to the floor, like someone had clawed at it in desperation. Beneath the bed, a single gold earring, and in the corner, tucked behind a chair, a child's sock, stained with something later identified as human blood. Yet there was no blood anywhere else, no fingerprints out of place, no signs of struggle. The house gave off a haunting stillness, the kind that made even seasoned officers lower their voices. In the garage, they found the strangest clue of all: a small trail of white powder leading from the door to the back wall, where the concrete had a faint discoloration, a patch that appeared newer than the rest. That patch would become central to the investigation. On the evening of October 17th, 3 days after the Carters were last seen, Denise's sister, Olivia Brooks, drove to the house after not hearing from her sister all weekend. She knocked, no answer. She tried calling, straight to voicemail. When she peered into the front window, she saw the family dog, Scout, alone and barking, agitated, frantic, pacing in circles. She called 911. Responding officers arrived within minutes. They entered the home with permission from Olivia and immediately noted the eerie calm. Everything was in place, but the family was gone. Food was on the counter. The children's pajamas were folded neatly on their beds. A full box of unopened diapers sat in Ava's closet, suggesting there had been no preparation for travel or sudden departure. Within hours, a missing persons alert was issued. Search efforts began, at first locally, with volunteers and flashlights combing nearby woods and riverbeds, then regionally, with helicopters, dogs, and tactical teams expanding the radius. But there was no sign of the Carter family, no texts, no purchases, no traffic cameras placing them outside the neighborhood. It was as if they had vanished into air. And for a town that had never dealt with anything larger than petty theft, the shock was immediate, and the fear came quickly behind. When Hollow Creek police received the missing persons report, they treated it as routine. It wasn't uncommon for families to leave town unexpectedly. Emergencies, last-minute trips, family matters. But as each hour passed without contact, something about the Carter case refused to settle into that explanation. By day 2, Chief Randall Greer had made the decision to involve the state police. He knew the town's resources weren't enough, and when investigators walked into the Carter home, it was immediately clear this wasn't abandonment. This was something else entirely. But that didn't mean answers came quickly. Detectives began by canvassing the neighborhood, house by house. Dozens were interviewed. Some described the family as warm and private, while others offered troubling fragments. Shouting heard late at night, porch lights left on until sunrise, children appearing tired during the day. One neighbor, Mrs. Ellie Monroe, recalled something that stood out. On the night of October 14th, she heard what she described as a soft, rhythmic banging, not loud enough to call attention to, but unsettling. She said it stopped suddenly after several minutes. At the time, she assumed it was nothing. After all, Hollow Creek wasn't the kind of place where things happened. By day 5, detectives turned their focus inward, to the Carter home itself. They brought in luminol, forensic technicians, scent-tracking dogs. The results were confounding. No traces of blood on the floors, no sign of chemicals, no break-in, no defensive marks. It was clean, obsessively clean. That kind of cleanliness was unnatural, and often it meant someone had taken the time to erase something. It was a single dog that gave the investigation its first major lead. Scout, the family's retriever, had been taken to a shelter for care. Days later, when detectives visited to photograph the dog, standard procedure for behavioral analysis, they noticed something, a small faded smear behind his left ear. Dried, almost missed. Lab analysis confirmed it was blood, not canine, human, later matched to Ava Carter. But where had it come from, and why wasn't there more? The discovery led to a second full sweep of the house, this time with infrared imaging and floor-penetrating radar. That's when investigators returned to the garage. The strange concrete patch at the rear wall had been noted before, but never fully investigated. Now, with equipment on site, technicians found what they called an anomaly beneath the surface, roughly 6 feet long, 2 feet wide. The garage was sealed as a crime scene. Excavation began the next morning. It took less than an hour to confirm the worst. Buried just beneath the poured concrete, wrapped in plastic and layers of blankets, were the remains of Marcus Carter. His hands were bound. His mouth had been taped. There were signs of blunt force trauma to the skull. Fatal. But there was no sign of Denise or the children. With one body confirmed, the tone of the investigation changed instantly. What had been a missing persons case was now a homicide, and in small towns that changes everything. Attention turned toward those closest to the Carters. The obvious question, if Marcus was found buried, what happened to his wife and children? Were they victims too? Or was there another possibility? Detectives began reconstructing Marcus Carter's final days in detail. Phone records, work logs, emails. That's when they found the first crack in the surface. A series of deleted messages had been recovered from Marcus's email server. Messages from a contact saved only as D. The content was minimal, but the tone was guarded, strained. The messages hinted at arguments, mentions of things getting worse at home. One read simply, "He knows. I saw it in his eyes." The address was traced to a private server registered to a woman named Danielle Forrester, a former member of Marcus's church group who had moved to Hollow Creek 6 months prior. Danielle lived less than 5 blocks from the Carters. She had no criminal record, no apparent connection, other than a shared church history. When interviewed, she claimed she hadn't spoken to Marcus in years, but phone pings told a different story, placing her less than 500 feet from the Carter home on the night of October 14th. Her alibi, she'd been home alone watching a movie, but her neighbor, a night shift nurse, said Danielle's porch light had been off, something she claimed never happened before. It was circumstantial, but enough to raise eyebrows. Meanwhile, public theories began to surface. Some believed Denise had killed her husband and fled. Others speculated a cult connection, a theory fueled by an anonymous online post claiming the Carters were involved in something they couldn't get out of. The post was quickly deleted. The account vanished. But amidst the noise, detectives focused on one detail, a security camera, one that had been written off early in the investigation due to poor lighting, caught a single blurry frame at 2:18 a.m., the night of October 14th. A person, short, hooded, dragging a large object across the Carter driveway. The footage was grainy, unusable for identification, but the timestamp matched the night Marcus was killed. Someone had gone to great lengths to remove him. And they weren't finished. By the second week, the investigation had stalled, leads had dried, theories were multiplying, and the public was beginning to turn. Online forums accused the police of hiding evidence. Commenters speculated that the Carters had never been real, that the photos were staged, that the story was manufactured. Even in Hollow Creek, rumors twisted into folklore. Some said the Carter house was cursed. Others swore they saw lights flickering in the garage at night. But then on October 28th, 14 days after the disappearance, the case broke open. It started with an overlooked camera, a motion-activated trail cam set up by a hunter on the northern edge of Black Ridge Woods, 6 miles outside Hollow Creek. The hunter hadn't checked the footage in weeks, but when he did, one image stood out. It was time-stamped October 15th, 4:12 a.m., just hours after Marcus was likely killed. The photo showed a lone figure, barefoot, stumbling along the tree line. The person was wearing what appeared to be a nightgown and was carrying something, a small object clutched tightly to their chest. The image was grainy, but the investigators recognized her. Denise Carter. The image, when released, stunned the public. How had she made it that far, alone with no vehicle? What was she carrying? And if she was alive then, where was she now? That question would lead to the most harrowing discovery of the entire case. 2 days later, a hiker named Camila Hernandez found something strange while walking a private trail near the same woods. A narrow storm drain covered in brush and tangled weeds. Inside, she thought she saw a shape. When she peered in, her scream echoed through the trees. What she found was Denise, alive. She was curled in a fetal position, caked in dirt, dehydrated, her fingernails torn and bleeding. Clutched in her arms was Ava, motionless. Ava was later pronounced dead at the hospital. Cause of death, blunt trauma to the skull. But not from that night. It had occurred days earlier. Denise had been carrying her child's lifeless body through the woods for nearly 2 days. The survival of Denise Carter changed the trajectory of everything. She was no longer missing. She was no longer presumed dead. She was the center of the story and the key to the truth. But in the hours following her discovery, Denise said nothing. Not to doctors, not to police. She refused food, refused questions. She stared out the window, unmoving. Until one detective, Rachel Nwosu, entered the room alone, without a notebook, without a badge, and simply asked, "What did you protect them from?" That's when Denise began to speak. The next 48 hours would upend every assumption investigators had held. According to Denise's initial statement, halting, fragile, incomplete, Marcus had not been the man his friends believed him to be. Behind closed doors, he had grown increasingly paranoid, obsessive, controlling. He believed they were being watched, followed, that Denise was hiding something, that the children had been corrupted. Denise claimed Marcus had begun locking the children in their rooms at night, that he'd installed new bolts on the doors, that he'd begun stockpiling items in the garage, bags of rice, batteries, jugs of water, and one item stood out, a shovel. She told detectives the night of October 14th was the breaking point. She had confronted him about a noise, a sound Ava said she heard from under her bed. When Denise went to investigate, she found Marcus standing in the garage holding a length of pipe. He said they needed to be ready. What happened next was a blur. Denise described shouting, pushing, then darkness. She awoke on the garage floor with Marcus's body next to her. She claimed she didn't remember striking him, but she remembered wrapping him, burying him. She said she did it because someone had to protect the kids. But the evidence told a more complex story. Marcus's injuries suggested multiple strikes, not one. There were no defensive wounds on Denise. And most telling, the plastic wrap used to conceal Marcus had Denise's fingerprints, but also another set, small, partial, belonging to Liam. Liam's body has never been found. Denise was arrested the following morning, charged with second-degree murder, child endangerment, and obstruction of justice. She entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. As the news broke, Hollow Creek recoiled. This wasn't a story of strangers in the night. There had been no intruder, no cult, no masked figure. The horror had grown quietly inside the Carter home, while the world outside slept in peace. The trial of Denise Carter began 6 months after her arrest, in a packed courthouse under the relentless attention of national media. By then, the story had become something more than a case. It was a symbol of hidden violence, of crumbling facades, of how easily truth can vanish behind closed doors. Prosecutors opened with a brutal timeline. They laid out the forensic evidence, the digital trails, the inconsistencies in Denise's own story. They showed images from the excavation. Marcus Carter's body wrapped in painter's plastic and 2 layers of plaid blankets, the same kind used on the Carter's beds. Then they moved to Ava, photos from the hospital, the report from the medical examiner. Her injury, a single deliberate blow to the back of the head. Prosecutor Lyle Jennings looked directly at the jury when he said, "This was not a breakdown. This was a decision. Ava did not die in a moment of panic. She died in silence after her father was already in the ground." Their theory was devastating, that Denise, overwhelmed and enraged, killed her husband, then faced with the consequences, killed Ava and vanished into the woods. But the defense told a different story. Led by attorney Catherine Huang, the defense team painted Denise as a long-suffering woman trapped in a nightmare of psychological abuse. They claimed Marcus had weaponized his charm, isolating her over time, and that Denise's actions were not calculated but protective, that she'd broken under the weight of survival. They brought in expert witnesses, psychologists, a behavioral trauma specialist. They showed home video clips from years before, Marcus laughing at a church picnic, then sharply grabbing Liam's wrist when he spilled a drink. Slow motion, freeze frame, subtle signs that few had noticed then, but which now pulsed with different meaning. Denise herself took the stand for only one day. Her voice barely rose above a whisper, but when shown a photograph of her children at a birthday party, all smiling, unaware of what was to come, she broke, completely. For 7 minutes, the courtroom was silent, but for her sobbing. Some jurors looked away. Others didn't blink. One was seen trembling. After 12 days of testimony and nearly 50 witnesses, the jury was sent to deliberate. It took them 18 hours. On the morning of July 3rd, the verdict was read: guilty of voluntary manslaughter in the death of Marcus Carter. Not guilty in the death of Ava Carter due to insufficient evidence. Guilty of obstruction of justice in child endangerment. Denise Carter was sentenced to 18 years in a state correctional facility with eligibility for parole in 12. No appeals were filed. Outside the courtroom, opinion was fractured. Some saw Denise as a failed mother, others as a victim pushed past the edge of reason, and then there were those who said justice had only been half served, because Liam Carter had never been found. Searches continued for weeks after the trial. Divers swept the creeks. Drones scanned the treetops. Tips poured in from across the state. Sightings, confessions, psychic visions. All were investigated. None held weight. To this day, Liam Carter remains missing, officially presumed dead. Unofficially, he is the ghost that haunts this case. In the aftermath, Hollow Creek tried to heal. The Carter home was sold to a developer and bulldozed. A memorial was placed in the town square. 3 stones etched with the names Marcus, Ava, and Liam. Some residents protested the inclusion of Marcus. Others lit candles beneath it every year. Time passed, but something stayed fractured. People double-locked their doors, left porch lights on, looked a little longer at their neighbors, as if, somewhere deep down, they now understood. Monsters don't always come from the outside. Hollow Creek was never the same. The street where the Carters lived still stands. But the house, the one that once held backyard barbecues, sleepovers, and school pickups, is gone. In its place, a patch of bare land that's never been resold. Children avoid it. Grown-ups don't speak of it. The town council tried to shift attention. New initiatives, outreach programs, more funding for mental health support. But for many, it felt like stitching over an old wound, one that still wept beneath the surface. Schools quietly introduced new safety protocols. Teachers were trained to spot signs of emotional abuse. At PTA meetings, parents whispered more urgently about things they'd once dismissed. The withdrawn child, the nervous parent, the friend who suddenly stopped coming over. And yet, despite everything that had been uncovered, no one could agree on one simple thing. Why? Why did it happen? Why didn't anyone see it coming? Why wasn't there help in time? Even the investigators who lived the case still wonder. Detective Rachel Nwosu, now retired, said in her last interview, "I still don't know if I was chasing a killer or someone trying to survive one." That's the weight this case left behind. Not just loss, but ambiguity. And ambiguity corrodes everything it touches. Beyond Hollow Creek, the Carter case forced new conversations about domestic silence, about the thin line between victim and perpetrator, and about how much of real life takes place in the shadows we ignore. Social workers pointed to it as a reminder that abuse doesn't always come with bruises. That charm can be a mask. That trauma doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers until it's too late. Law enforcement agencies across the region used the case as a training module. Profilers debated Marcus Carter's behavior for years afterward. Was he preparing for something? A collapse? An escape? Or was it all just unraveling at the seams? Even psychologists disagreed. Some called Denise a textbook case of coercive control. Others believed she fabricated parts of her story to mask deeper guilt. The truth may never be fully known. And then there was the audience, the people watching from afar. Online, the Carter case became something else entirely. Endless theories, timeline breakdowns, amateur sleuths tracking Denise's prison records, people combing satellite imagery of the woods, still hoping to find Liam. Because the story didn't end with a trial, or a verdict, or a sentence. It didn't even end with a grave. It ended in the place no one can ever touch, the space where certainty fails, and all that remains is what we choose to believe. From the outside, they look like any other family. The Carters of Hollow Creek, a quiet street, a tidy home, holiday lights in December, birthday balloons in April. But behind that door, something unspoken had been building, and in just 72 hours, that silence shattered, leaving behind a buried husband, a lost child, a grieving mother accused of everything, in a town forced to face what it never wanted to see. The investigation peeled back layer after layer. What began as a missing persons report became a homicide. What looked like a home became a crime scene, and what seemed like answers only deepened the mystery. Marcus Carter, Ava Carter, Liam Carter. One buried, one broken, one vanished. And at the center, Denise Carter, survivor, suspect, mother, killer. The truth may live somewhere in those woods, or in the pages of court transcripts, or perhaps only in the silence Denise keeps to this day. But here's what we do know. Tragedy rarely announces itself. It festers, it hides, sometimes in the places we feel safest. And that's the story of Hollow Creek, a place where a smile masked a scream, where help never came fast enough, where one family disappeared, piece by piece, in plain sight. We tell these stories not just to understand what happened, but to ask what we missed. Because stories like this, real, harrowing, unresolved, aren't about monsters. They're about people, and that makes them even harder to forget. If this story moved you or left you with questions, you're not alone. What do you believe happened to Liam Carter? Do you think justice was truly served? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more true crime stories told with care, detail, and respect for the real lives behind the headlines, subscribe now. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep investigation. And remember, sometimes the darkest stories come from the quietest places. Thank you for watching.